By the winter of 1940, Britain stood at a moment of peril unmatched in its history. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies over occupied Europe. Night after night, waves of German bombers crossed the Channel to strike at the heart of Britain's cities: London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Coventry. All were engulfed in flame. For the civilians of London, the Blitz was not a moment, but a condition. A state of endurance that stretched from September 1940 through to May 1941. Nearly every night, sirens sounded. People filed underground to the stations, huddling between the rails, clutching blankets and gas masks. The air was thick with soot, the streets lined with shattered glass that glimmered like frost under the moonlight. Yet the city lived on. Firemen, wardens, ambulance drivers, and ordinary residents moved through the wreckage with quiet precision. They learned to read the sounds of war, the drone of Heinkels, the whistle of incendiaries, the distant crump of impact followed by silence. And in that silence, the aftermath, came the count of the missing, the toll of the mourning. It was in this landscape that Mary Collins's story began. Not in the bomb shelters, but in the uncertain divide between evacuation and home. In September 1939, as war was declared, nearly 1.5 million children were moved from Britain's cities to the countryside under Operation Pied Piper. It was the largest movement of civilians in British history. Government posters urged parents to send their children to safety. School groups gathered at stations, each child wearing a cardboard name tag, carrying a small gas mask and a bundle of clothes. For many families, it was an act of faith and heartbreak. Mothers like Mary watched their sons and daughters vanish into trains, uncertain if they would ever meet again. Evacuation worked unevenly. In some towns, rural families took children gladly. In others, evacuees faced resentment and hardship. Letters between parents and host families moved slowly, censored by wartime controls. Trains ran irregularly, sometimes cancelled altogether after air raids or track damage. By 1940, as the Luftwaffe's focus turned to London, many mothers began to question the scheme. Rumors spread of overcrowding, of farms without proper care, of billets in distant counties unfit for children. Some, unable to bear the separation, made the journey themselves, traveling without authorization to bring their children home. It was a quiet rebellion within the home front, an unrecorded migration of mothers through blackout Britain. Mary Collins was one of them. Her husband, a dock worker in Poplar, had been killed in an air raid the previous month. Her eldest, Thomas, aged 8, and twin girls, Elsie and May, 6, had been evacuated earlier that summer to Somerset, a rural county more than 100 miles away. When she received the telegram about the bombing of the line near Taunton, she realized she might be the only one who could reach them. The government had forbidden unnecessary travel. Rail links were fragmented, and roadways were under blackout conditions. Yet, for many like her, rules became irrelevant in the face of uncertainty. In the chaos of the Blitz, official channels could not account for every missing child, every delayed train, every destroyed village. In the records of the Ministry of Home Security, there are brief mentions of such journeys. Mothers walking from station to station, searching for lost evacuees, moving through bombed rail yards and darkened roads. They are fragments. Civilian female, mid-30s, traveling alone, presumed seeking family. For every statistic of the Blitz, there were thousands of unrecorded acts of resolve. While Churchill's speeches stirred the nation, it was people, like Mary, unarmed, unrecognized, who carried the weight of survival. Their struggles took place not in the headlines, but in the margins of official reports, where the ordinary became extraordinary by sheer persistence. By the start of 1941, the Blitz had become a rhythm, brutal, relentless, and strangely predictable. Londoners learned to gauge danger by the direction of the bombers and the color of the sky. "Fire over Stepney tonight," they would say, or "the docks are going again." The air smelled perpetually of smoke and damp plaster. Windows were taped against shattering glass, curtains drawn tight against the searchlight beams that swept like silent sentinels over the Thames. The East End suffered the worst. Its proximity to the docks, lifeline of Britain's wartime supply, made it a prime target. Entire streets vanished overnight. Nissen huts, hastily built to house the displaced, stood amid the rubble. And yet, life carried on. Milk deliveries resumed the morning after a raid. Children still queued at sweet shops when rationing allowed. The resilience was instinctive. Survival as a habit, not a choice. For working-class mothers, this endurance required a kind of invisible heroism. Food queues stretched for hours. Ration coupons had to be traded, borrowed, or saved. Water mains burst in bomb craters, forcing families to fetch buckets from fire hydrants. When the sirens wailed, mothers bundled children in blankets, shepherding them to Anderson shelters or underground stations, sometimes for 10 hours at a stretch. Still, amid this grim routine, a quiet defiance grew. Letters from the countryside told of loneliness and longing. Many evacuated children begged to come home. Teachers, billeted with pupils, reported that some mothers had turned up unannounced, having walked miles through the blackout to fetch their own. These journeys, rarely recorded, became the unspoken counterpart to the government's evacuation scheme. Mary Collins's journey began on a cold morning in February 1941 at Liverpool Street Station. The glass roof was cracked from a recent raid. The platforms littered with soot and debris. Trains left irregularly, their destinations chalked hastily on boards. She carried only a small case, a tin of condensed milk, and her husband's photograph. Her ration book was folded inside her coat, her one proof of identity. The journey westward was treacherous. Sections of track had been destroyed. Passengers were sometimes asked to disembark and walk between halted trains. Entire stations operated under dim, flickering lamps, blackout curtains hanging over shattered windows. At night, searchlights cut the clouds, and the dull glow of distant fires lit the horizon. Mary was not alone. She traveled alongside other women, each with a story that mirrored hers. A lost son, a silent billet, a telegram unanswered. They spoke little. Conversation felt dangerous in wartime, when even a name could be overheard. Yet in shared silence, they formed a kind of fellowship. Strangers united by maternal instinct, moving through a country at war with itself, one half burning, the other pretending peace. To understand the courage of these women, one must understand the scale of dislocation. By early 1941, over 60,000 London homes had been destroyed. More than 40,000 civilians were dead, half of them women and children. Yet amidst such devastation, Britain's civil structure held. The post office delivered letters even after raids. The BBC broadcast from makeshift studios. And in the basements of the Ministry of Information, officials debated how to portray the nation's endurance to the world, how to turn suffering into morale. The story of Mary Collins and others, like her, was not one of defiance against government, but of love, transcending regulation. These were not acts of rebellion, but of faith. Faith that home, however broken, was still safer in a mother's arms than in a stranger's care. In the archives of the Imperial War Museum, one can find faded letters. "My children are in Somerset. I must go to them. The trains no longer run. but I will walk." Such words, scrawled in pencil on ration paper, speak to a truth rarely shown in the grand narratives of war, that for many, victory meant simply holding one's family together. As the winter of 1941 deepened, Mary approached her destination. Ahead lay the countryside, the quiet fields that had seemed so distant from the roar of London. Behind her, the city still burned. The evacuation of 1939 was intended as Britain's shield against German air raids. Under Operation Pied Piper, more than 1.5 million children were sent from cities to rural towns and villages across England, Scotland, and Wales. It was one of the largest civilian movements in British history. Orderly on paper, but chaotic in reality. Mothers were told to let go. Trains departed in silence, children clutching gas masks and paper labels tied to their coats. The government assured parents that their sons and daughters would be safe, that they would return once victory came. But few were prepared for the emotional toll. For working-class families from London's East End, the evacuation often felt like exile. Some children were sent to homes where they were treated as servants. Others fell ill in cold farmhouses far from hospitals. Letters took weeks to arrive. Rumors of sickness, neglect, or mistreatment spread through the underground shelters of London like wildfire. Mary Collins's decision to find her children was not unique, only unrecorded. In wartime Britain, travel was restricted, petrol rationed, identification demanded at every stop. Yet hundreds of women took to the roads, hitching rides on military lorries or walking by night through counties they had never seen. They were dismissed as runaways by officials, but their determination carried a deeper truth. No policy could suppress a mother's instinct to protect her own. Behind every statistic of evacuation lay a story of loss. A mother's fear that love had been replaced by distance, that safety had come at the cost of closeness. While men fought overseas, British women waged their own kind of war. In 1941, over 7 million women were engaged in wartime labor, from munitions and aircraft assembly to the Women's Voluntary Service, the ATS, and the Land Army. Yet even among these, the unrecorded labor of motherhood was the most constant and perilous. Mary Collins's journey unfolded in the midst of this quiet revolution. The Blitz had redefined domestic endurance. Women dug out shelters, nursed neighbors, and cared for the wounded as bombs fell overhead. Some served as ARP wardens, guiding families to safety through collapsing streets. Others joined the auxiliary fire service, pulling hoses through burning alleys. But beyond these recognized roles were thousands of women who simply refused to yield, who turned trauma into motion. Mary's trek across England embodied that spirit. Every step she took defied both enemy fire and bureaucratic expectation. She was not fighting Hitler directly, yet her persistence embodied what Churchill would later call Britain's finest hour. Ordinary people standing firm when there was nothing left to stand on. The image of the British mother, apron torn, hands blistered yet unbroken, became a symbol of national endurance. The Ministry of Information's propaganda quietly drew upon such real stories, even if names like Mary's never appeared in print. They represented the moral fabric that kept Britain intact. Courage without recognition. Sacrifice without reward. To cross England in 1941 was to move through a country divided by silence. Trains ran sporadically, blackouts turned towns into voids, and petrol scarcity made motor travel a rarity. Bombed bridges, cratered roads, and flooded valleys marked the path of destruction. Yet in the midst of it all, the countryside seemed eerily untouched. The pastoral heart of Britain now sheltering its urban refugees. Mary's route took her through the Midlands, past shuttered factories and quiet villages where church bells had been silenced to signal invasion warnings. She traveled by foot, cart, and sometimes by kindness. A soldier's rations shared, a farmer's barn opened for shelter. The landscape bore the scars of both endurance and fear. To city dwellers, the countryside had once seemed remote. Now it was a refuge and a reminder. Farmers plowed beneath watchful skies. Airfields sprouted across former pastures. The roar of Spitfires overhead mingled with birdsong. This collision of peace and peril defined wartime Britain, a nation holding its breath. When Mary finally saw the familiar hedgerows of Somerset, it was not beauty she noticed, but the silence. No guns, no sirens, just the distant echo of her own footsteps, and the hope that somewhere beyond the fields, her children still waited. The journey revealed something essential about Britain itself. A land resilient yet fractured, bound together by the ordinary courage of its people. The German bombing campaign against Britain, known as the Blitz, was more than military strategy. It was psychological warfare. Between September 1940 and May 1941, over 43,000 civilians were killed and nearly 2 million made homeless. Entire districts vanished beneath fire and rubble. Yet, remarkably, morale did not break. In London, even after the heaviest raids, Coventry, Liverpool, East End, and Bristol, the next morning brought queues for milk, buses running on time, and markets reopening amid ruins. The phrase, "the British spirit," was not propaganda. It was survival through routine. For mothers like Mary Collins, the Blitz was not a campaign of nights. It was a season that never ended. Sleep came only between air raid sirens. Mornings began with the all clear. It was in this crucible of fear and fatigue that she found the strength to act. Each firestorm made her resolve harder. Each night in a shelter deepened her certainty that waiting was not enough. The courage of civilians, chronicled later by BBC war reports and mass observation diaries, revealed the true front line of Britain's war. It was not the trenches of France, but the doorsteps of ordinary streets, the kitchen tables, the shelters, the shattered schools. Mary's journey was an extension of that front, an act of defiance against despair itself. Britain's railways were the silent enablers of both war and survival. In 1940, as Luftwaffe bombers targeted industrial cities, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, LMS, and other networks became lifelines, transporting troops, munitions, and evacuees under constant threat. Stations were crowded with soldiers, nurses, and children clutching name tags. By 1941, large sections of track were damaged. Bridges lay in ruins, sidings blocked by derailed wagons, signal boxes obliterated. Yet the network never ceased. Railwaymen worked through the raids, clearing debris by torchlight, hammering steel in the glow of burning warehouses. Mary Collins entered this world of soot and movement, a realm where every train was a gamble. Civilians were not permitted to travel freely, yet station masters often turned a blind eye when they recognized desperation. The journey was perilous. Trains halted for hours under blackout orders. Stations plunged into darkness at every alarm. She moved through bombed-out platforms and carriage corridors thick with soldiers' kit bags. The whistle of the engine became, for many evacuees and mothers alike, the sound of fragile hope, proof that Britain still connected, still moved despite everything. The railway, like the people it served, embodied quiet endurance. Every mile of track carried not just supplies or troops, but the will of a nation that refused to stop running. Wartime Britain thrived not only on strategy and strength, but on a network of quiet kindness. Along Mary's journey, ordinary citizens became her allies, people who shared without question, guided without recognition. The Women's Voluntary Service, WVS, was at the heart of this unseen movement. Volunteers ran rest centers, staffed mobile canteens, and offered comfort to those displaced by raids. In small towns, parish churches opened their halls to travelers. School teachers organized billets for strangers. Farmers left food by the roadside for evacuees passing through. It was through such gestures that Mary was able to continue. A loaf of bread from a vicar's wife, a cup of tea from a signalman, a spare blanket from a nurse on night duty. None of it was recorded in any archive, yet this was the social fabric that held Britain together when its infrastructure failed. Historians often describe the Blitz in terms of destruction: tonnage of bombs, cities burned, statistics of death. But beneath those numbers ran something less measurable: compassion as quiet resistance. Mary's journey became a testament to that spirit. She was one among thousands who survived not because the state protected them, but because strangers did. It was this unspoken unity, stretching from the bombed streets of London to the peaceful fields of Somerset, that transformed tragedy into endurance. When Britain later spoke of standing alone, it was these moments, of shared bread, of open doors, that gave the phrase its true meaning. By the spring of 1941, the worst of the London Blitz had begun to ease. Hitler had turned his attention eastward, towards the Soviet Union. Yet across Britain, the scars of 9 months of bombardment remained raw. Cities smoldered, families were scattered, and silence had replaced the siren. For Mary Collins, it was now or never. The telegram had not confirmed her children's fate, only that the train carrying evacuees from Paddington to Devon had been hit near Taunton, its passengers unaccounted for. The government advised patience. The Red Cross offered forms and waiting lists. But Mary could not rest among the ruins of Stepney. The city that had raised her children was gone, its streets hollowed by fire, its neighbors buried or gone to war. She packed what she had left: a ration card, a photograph, and her youngest's woolen scarf. Her journey began before dawn. The blackout was lifting, but fog still hung low over the river. She walked south from Whitechapel, crossing the Thames where the great Vauxhall Bridge stood blackened but intact. Around her, London stirred, milkmen pushing carts past cratered pavements, trams creaking under shattered glass. At Waterloo Station, the concourse was a mosaic of exhaustion. Soldiers in khaki slumped beside civilians clutching parcels, railway porters sweeping glass from the tiles. Overhead, the roof still bore the holes from incendiary raids. Mary found a clerk who told her, quietly, that trains west were running, irregularly, but running. The journey to the West Country was a voyage through the geography of Britain's endurance. From the ruins of Reading to the half-repaired sidings of Newbury, the land unfolded like a wounded page. Convoys rolled beside the tracks. Barrage balloons floated above factory towns. Occasionally, the train stopped in darkness as anti-aircraft guns fired in the distance. Even now, even here, at Taunton, she stepped out into a station that smelled of ash and coal. A Red Cross notice board bore the names of the injured, the evacuated, the missing. Some were marked "found," most were not. Volunteers moved quietly between benches, handing out tea. Mary searched the lists, finger tracing each line of faint pencil. Nothing. No Collins. No Stepney. No children of 3. She turned to leave. And that was when she heard it. A voice, small and uncertain, calling, "Mum?" It was not her own, but it was a child's voice. And in that instant, Mary realized something that would carry her forward: that the children of war had become everyone's to protect. Her task was not finished by finding her own, but by helping those who had lost everyone. That night, she volunteered at the rest center established in Taunton's Church Hall. Rows of camp beds filled the nave, each one holding a story. Some children clutched suitcases, others only the clothes they wore. They were frightened, hungry, and far from home, yet alive. Through the next days, she worked without pause, sorting names, writing letters, tracing origins. The records were a maze of crossed wires and missing trains. Eventually, through the coordination of a local WVS officer, she found the lead she needed. A group of evacuees from the same convoy had reached Yeovil, 20 miles south. The following morning, she walked. The roads were cratered, the hedgerows scarred by shrapnel, but the countryside glowed with a kind of muted calm. RAF lorries passed, soldiers waved. The war was still everywhere. But so, too, was life. By the time she reached the small Somerset village of South Petherton, her feet were bloodied and her voice hoarse. Yet what she saw there ended the journey that had defined her courage. 3 children standing beside a village green, clutching their school satchels. A local woman, their temporary guardian, had taken them in after the bombing. They were frightened, thinner, changed, but alive. When Mary finally knelt before them, there were no tears, no words, only the silence of relief, and the low hum of an RAF patrol passing high above, carrying on its own endless journey. Her impossible walk through a nation under siege had succeeded, but its meaning went beyond her family. It became a quiet echo of what millions endured. The will to reach through fire and loss, and to find what mattered most. The reunion in South Petherton did not mark an end, but a beginning. The moment where private love and public endurance merged into one story of national survival. For Mary Collins, the war did not suddenly ease because her children were safe. Britain itself was still burning. Night raids continued along the south coast. Ports like Plymouth, Portsmouth, and Southampton bore the brunt of new attacks. Even rural Somerset trembled when bombers strayed off course, dropping their payloads over fields and orchards. Yet the calm of the countryside offered a kind of fragile healing, an echo of the England people still believed in. Mary and her children were billeted with a local couple, the Harrises, a retired railwayman and his wife. Their cottage, like many in wartime villages, was simple but alive with care. The fire burned low, blackout curtains hung thick, and a wireless played the nightly BBC home service. It was here that Mary first heard Churchill's words broadcast from Downing Street. "We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down." Those lines, written for soldiers, spoke directly to people like her, the civilians who had endured not with rifles or ranks, but with faith and perseverance. In the weeks that followed, Mary joined the Women's Voluntary Service as a helper at the local evacuation center. The same determination that had carried her across a bombed nation now fueled her work among the displaced. She organized clothing drives, repaired uniforms, and helped reunite other families separated by chaos. There were hundreds of stories like hers, small acts of endurance that built the backbone of Britain's home front. One woman cycled from Bristol to Exeter to find her son. Another walked from Hackney to Oxford when her child's billet address was lost. They were rarely reported in the press, but their courage resonated through every street, every shelter. To the British government, these were simply civilian adjustments. To the nation, they were the proof that compassion could travel further than fear. By mid-1941, the Blitz was officially over. The Luftwaffe had shifted its attention to the Eastern Front, leaving British cities to rebuild amid dust and silence. Yet the psychological strain endured. Children returned from the countryside older, distant, sometimes unable to recognize the homes they'd left behind. Mothers like Mary faced a new kind of challenge. Not survival, but reconstruction. When the all-clear sirens finally ceased their nightly haunting, what followed was not peace, but exhaustion. Streets once familiar were now unrecognizable. Whole neighborhoods flattened, churches gutted, factories gone. Yet amid the devastation, people rebuilt from memory. In Stepney, neighbors who had fled slowly returned. They found nothing standing but the church spire and the community hall. Brick by brick, they began again, sweeping, salvaging, hammering. The same endurance that had driven Mary to walk across England now filled the hearts of thousands rebuilding their lives. This, perhaps more than any battle, was the true turning point of Britain's war, when civilians refused to yield to despair. In the archives of the Imperial War Museum, countless diaries from this period record the same quiet sentiment. We carry on. It was not triumph, not defiance, but a calm acknowledgement of duty. Britain's strength was not in its armies alone, but in the unbroken rhythm of its ordinary people. Mary's journey came to symbolize that rhythm. Though her name never appeared in any official record, her story echoed through the millions of unspoken acts that defined wartime endurance, each one a small defiance against the darkness that had sought to break them. When her children later recalled the journey, years after the war, they did not remember the terror or the hunger. They remembered their mother's steady hand, her quiet words, the way she walked ahead through the smoke without once looking back. In the end, that was how Britain endured, by walking forward, one step at a time, through ruin and uncertainty, until light returned to the skies. When the Blitz finally ended in May 1941, Britain emerged changed beyond recognition. The fires had been extinguished, but the damage endured in the faces of those who had lived beneath the sirens. Nearly 2 million homes were destroyed or damaged. Tens of thousands of children were still displaced. And in every street that once rang with laughter, there were gaps, quiet absences where families had been lost to the war. For mothers like Mary Collins, the victory of survival was bittersweet. She had found her children alive, but her home was gone. Stepney, once a tight-knit community of dock workers and market traders, now stood half-leveled, its skyline jagged, its pavements scarred with bomb craters filled by rainwater. The East End had taken the brunt of London's bombardment. Rows of terraced houses had simply ceased to exist. Yet the spirit of the people did not vanish with the rubble. Those who returned to London brought with them stories of fields, barns, and strangers' kindnesses. For the first time, many working-class families had glimpsed a different Britain beyond the factory smoke. Rural communities, too, had changed. They had learned to open their doors to city children, to feed and teach them, to share the rhythm of harvest and hymn. This exchange, born of crisis, reshaped the social map of Britain. It blurred the boundaries between city and countryside, class and region. Historians would later call it the leveling of the home front. But for Mary and her children, it was simply survival shared. In the months following her return, Mary joined her local ARP warden's post, the same network that had once guided her through darkness. Her duties were humble but vital, delivering supplies, checking shelters, tending to the injured during post-raid cleanups. She worked not for recognition, but because she could not sit still. Her quiet service reflected a wider truth, that Britain's post-Blitz recovery depended not on orders from Westminster, but on ordinary people rebuilding from the ground up. Volunteers, mothers, and veterans cleared debris side by side. Children planted allotments where houses once stood. Street by street, the city began to breathe again. Churchill called it the spirit of defiance turned to construction. Newspapers spoke of London's second battle, not against bombs, but against despair. In every parish hall, names of the lost were handwritten on boards. In every kitchen, the conversation turned to rationing, rebuilding, and the faint promise of peace. For Mary, those months marked a strange peace of their own. Her children slept soundly again. The sound of aircraft no longer sent them running. But the war was far from over. It had simply shifted elsewhere, to the North Atlantic, to the deserts of North Africa, and soon to the skies of Europe once more. Still, in that brief calm after the Blitz, A truth had settled across Britain. The home front had held, and it had held not through weaponry or power, but through endurance, through mothers who walked, neighbors who shared, and strangers who helped. By 1942, Britain was no longer fighting for survival alone. It was fighting for recovery. The government's wartime ministries began to plan what would come after victory: reconstruction, welfare, housing. The devastation of the Blitz had laid bare the inequalities of pre-war Britain, and the people who had endured it, the factory workers, the miners, the mothers, demanded a better nation in return. Reports such as the Beveridge Plan, 1942, spoke of a new social contract, a promise to abolish want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. It was a vision born not in Parliament, but in streets like Stepney, where citizens had already proven what unity could achieve. Mary Collins, like millions of women who had carried the country through its darkest days, became part of that quiet transformation. Her sons grew strong in the fields of Somerset, helping the land girls bring in the harvests that kept Britain fed through blockade. Her daughter joined the WVS, serving tea to troops at local canteens. Mary herself volunteered at a bomb relief office, sorting aid parcels for families returning to London. None of it was glamorous. All of it was necessary. When she finally went back to Stepney in 1944, the city was changed again, rebuilt in patches, scarred in others. Whole streets had been cleared for reconstruction. The smell of fresh mortar replaced that of ash, but it was no longer the London she had left. It was quieter, older, humbler, and proud. There was no monument to women like her, no medal, no ceremony. Yet their work was visible in every rationed loaf, every mended roof, every child sent safely to school. They had carried Britain not through glory, but through endurance. In later years, historians and writers would revisit those months with admiration, the period when the British people became their own defenders. Mass observation diaries recorded it best. It is the small acts that keep us from collapse. Mary's impossible journey became one such act, not recorded in any official report, but whispered in kitchens, retold in shelters, remembered by children who never forgot what courage looked like when it wore an apron and carried a suitcase. After the war, when victory came and the sirens fell silent forever, Britain honored its fallen and rebuilt its cities. But its greatest victory, perhaps, was something quieter: the endurance of humanity amidst inhuman destruction. In that sense, Mary's story was never singular. It stood for a generation, for the mothers who refused to surrender their children to fate, for the workers who built by hand what bombs destroyed, for a nation that would not break. The Blitz had tested Britain's strength. Women like Mary proved it. In the end, Mary Collins's journey was not marked by medals or by mention in any war communique. Like so many others, her courage was anonymous, written not in the record books of generals, but in the quiet, enduring memory of a nation. The Blitz was more than an air campaign. It was a test of the human spirit. London's streets became front lines, its houses became shelters, and its civilians, the women and children, the fire watchers and stretcher bearers, became soldiers of a different kind. Through their calm endurance, they turned fear into defiance and tragedy into resolve. For every bomb that fell, 100 small acts of courage rose in answer. A mother leading her children through fire, a neighbor sharing a crust of bread, a warden refusing to abandon his post. Each act, unseen, unrecorded, helped Britain endure what Churchill called our finest hour. When the war finally ended, the ruins of London stood as both scar and testament. Yet beneath the rubble, something far stronger had taken root, a sense of unity, of shared fate. Britain had faced extinction and survived, not through superiority of weapons, but through the stubborn decency of its people. Mary's story embodies that truth. Her impossible journey was, in truth, one among thousands. But it reminds us that the war's greatest victories were not won in the air or at sea. They were won in kitchens, in shelters, on the long walks out of burning streets. The mother who carried her children through the Blitz carried, too, the quiet strength of a nation that refused to yield. And in that, she helped save not only her family, but something essential in the British spirit itself. London, 1940. As the Luftwaffe's bombs tore through the heart of Britain, one mother made an unthinkable choice: to risk everything for her children's survival. This powerful documentary retells the true story of Mary Collins, an ordinary woman from Stepney whose courage captured the quiet heroism that defined the Blitz. Through rare archival images, eyewitness accounts, and cinematic narration, we travel deep into the streets of wartime London, the blackout alleys, the fire-scarred rooftops, the underground shelters where thousands took refuge. Amidst the chaos, Mary's impossible journey unfolds. A mother leading her children through burning streets, guided only by the sound of distant church bells and her will to protect them. This film reveals more than one woman's struggle. It is a portrait of Britain under siege, a nation of civilians standing firm as the bombs fell. From the terror of the East End to the calm defiance of ordinary citizens, this story captures the resilience that became Britain's greatest weapon. Drawing on official wartime reports, BBC war records, and eyewitness diaries preserved in the Imperial War Museum, how one mother's impossible journey saved her children from the Blitz honors the unseen heroes who held Britain together when its cities were burning. Through cinematic reconstruction and emotional storytelling, this documentary reminds us that courage is often quiet, and sometimes wears an apron instead of a uniform. In the ruins of the Blitz, ordinary people performed extraordinary acts. This is one of them.